Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming. I'm Dr. Richard O'Brien, Director of the John D. O'Brien African American Institute, and I would like to welcome you here. Uh, this space, the Cabral Center, is one of the, right now, most used spaces on campus. It happens to be a place that the students use on a fairly regular basis, but as you see, hosting events like this, and as well as President Ayoun actually likes this as one of his favorite spaces on campus. It really gets a lot of energy and a lot of use, and so we are so proud to be able to use it today to be able to honor our sister, Dr. Régine Jean-Charles. Let's give her a round of applause. Thank you. So I welcome everybody to this wonderful occasion, this new book launch, Reimagining Together, Martin Luther King and the Trumpet of Conscience today, featuring Dr. Jean-Charles. And I'm happy to formally read her bio and be a part of her introduction, and welcome her as a new colleague and as a friend to Northeastern. She literally hit the ground running upon arrival and hasn't stopped since, and so it's really exciting to be able to have this opportunity to formally welcome her. I also want to extend a wonderful thank you to Dean Udo Fuega. She gets mad at me for calling her Dean, but I can't help it. The College of Social Science and Humanities, as well as Dr. Lori Lefkowitz. Hey, Lori, it's good to see you. Both of them, I really enjoy partnering with them. Dr. Lori Lefkowitz is chair of the Humanities Center, or director of the Humanities Center. I really enjoy being able to partner with both of you all, and it's certainly on this important event. So, Dr. Régine Michelle Jean-Charles is the Dean's Professor of Culture and Social Justice, as well as Director of Africana Studies here at Northeastern University. A Black feminist scholar who works at the intersection of race, gender, and justice from a global perspective, her scholarship and teaching include work on Black France, African diasporic literatures, Caribbean studies, Haiti and Haitian diaspora. She has authored over 30 publications that have appeared in books, edited volumes, and peer-reviewed journals. Her first book, Conflict Bodies, The Politics of Rape Representation in the Francophone Imaginary, out of Ohio State University Press, examines theoretical, visual, and literary texts in order to challenge global rape culture. Her most recent book, The Trumpet of Conscience today, out of Orbis Press, considers a three social justice movement: the movement for Black lives, the Me Too movement, and prison abolition through the lens of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King lesser-known speeches in The Call to Conscience. Her book, Looking for Other Worlds, Black Feminism and Haitian Fiction, will be out next year with University of Virginia Press. Dr. Jean-Charles holds a BA from the University of Pennsylvania, as well as a master's and PhD from Harvard University. She has received fellowships from the Ford Foundation, the Mellon Mays Foundation, and the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, as well as Dr. Carter G. Woodson Institute in African American Studies at UVA. She is a regular contributor to media outlets like Ms. Magazine, the Boston Globe, WGBH, America Magazine, and the Cognoscenti, where she has weighed in on topics such as Me Too, Black girlhood, and issues affecting the Haitian diaspora. Much of Dr. Jean-Charles' activist work has been with A Long Walk Home, where she began as founding board member in 2003. A Long Walk Home is a nonprofit organization that uses art to educate, inspire, and mobilize young people to end violence against girls and women. Her involvement in ALWH ranged from performing in the story of a rape survivor, a multimedia arts performance about Black women, and sexual assault, conducting workshops for the Girl/Friends Leadership Institute in Chicago, to giving lectures at universities across the country on topics such as study abroad, and sexual assault. Her work with Boston area includes initiatives with Shatter the Silence, a faith-based initiative to address sexual violence, and AFB, the Haitian Women's Association of Boston. I'm gonna have Dean Fuega come up and share a few words, and then we will turn it over to our very special guest, Dr. Jean Charles. So, Dean Fuega.
Thank you so much, Dr. O'Brien, and thank you for allowing me today to follow you. I just insisted that I speak second because I thought what I'm going to say would make much more sense after you have heard the many accomplishments that Dr. Régine Jean-Charles has put together in her amazing path that has most recently led her here to us in the College of Social Sciences and Humanities, into the Africana Studies program, and to Northeastern more generally. I just want to express my delight and my pride in the fact, Régine, that you have decided to join us, and that you are here now, and that you are already so clearly a leader in the university's mission and in various aspects of the university's missions. Some of you may know that the College of Social Sciences and Humanities has defined itself as the whole of the experiential liberal arts. And I will just say that Professor Jean-Charles fits so squarely as a leader into that kind of mission, and that we are so pleased that she is now with us in order to shape that mission further. And let me just give you a few examples of why that is the case. Dr. Jean-Charles, as you just have heard from Dr. O'Brien, is, of course, a major public intellectual, someone who speaks to academic audiences in her books, someone who also speaks to broader audiences. And it is so great that we are today going to learn much more about a book that is really connecting important figures, important developments, one of the figures, of course, of the 1960s, to the questions that we are confronting today. And it is this kind of work, I think, that makes Dr. Jean-Charles so effective. You also heard from Dr. O'Brien that Dr. Jean-Charles is someone who is deeply engaged in communities and deeply engaged in collaborations. And I will just say that community co-defining, community co-creation, community engagement, as well as collaboration, are very much issues that are on the agenda for the academy and are also on the agenda for the humanities, which sometimes have not been as engaged as they might be, and sometimes have struggled with how to teach collaboration. So for all those reasons too, it is so exciting to have Dr. Jean-Charles at Northeastern. As you know, she has been a teacher of a famous service learning course at her former institution, and we are so pleased, this is what we say for code, right? Former institution across, one of those across those rivers. And we are so pleased that she is bringing these kinds of experiences and that kind of energy already into our classrooms. I will just say that just a couple of weeks ago, some of us had the pleasure of seeing Dr. Jean-Charles present to our Dean Strategy Council. And she started out by just describing how she interacts with students in all of her classes, how she meets with every student individually, and how she figures out with that student how the path through her course will empower that student. And this energy of being able to empower others is also something that is just so, so clear for all of us who now have the pleasure of interacting with Dr. Jean-Charles on a much, much more daily basis. So, Régine, thanks so much for joining us. Thank you also very much to those who have supported this event. Richard already mentioned the centers at the university that are supporting it. I also want to thank the Africana Studies program and the Department of Culture, Societies, and Global Studies, Mika Morikawa and Savita, for your support of this event. And I'm very glad that we are having room for interactions here today, as well as an audience that is joining us elsewhere, an audience that we don't see, but we know they are there as well. And I want to give a special shout out also to India Lorik Wilmot, who is going to interview Dr. Jean-Charles about this important book, and just look so much forward to learning much more about Martin Luther King and the Trumpet of Conscience today. Régine, without further ado, the floor is yours.
I hope you to read from the book. So it will be nice to have the one that has the spots I marked. Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you, Richard. Richard and Uta were two of the first people I met at Northeastern. And I'll never forget in the summer, especially when I met Richard in person for the first time, and he gave me this huge hug, and it just felt so warm and welcoming. And he introduced me to this beautiful space. And as soon as we walked in here, I was like, you know I have a book coming out in October, right? And this is where we're going to launch it. So thank you, Richard, because you remember when that was just an idea in my head. Thank you so much to Uta, who is so persuasive. And you know, whenever people ask me, why did I leave Boston College to come to Northeastern, one of the things that I always mention is you, Uta, and just how intentional you are about developing leaders. And I really appreciate that so much. So thank you. Thank you to my team. Mika and Savita, where's Mika? Mika and Savita, who are these incredible, incredible women who are really running the Africana Studies program. I am the director, but when I tell you, nothing would be possible without these two. So we're so, so grateful for Mika and everything she does for all of culture, societies, and global studies. For me, I'd say especially Africana. And to Savita, who I have the pleasure of also having in the classroom this semester. So I leaned over and asked her if she felt empowered. So you can ask her if the things that Dean Fuega are saying are actually true. So thank you. I just wanted to give another shout out to the O'Brien Institute overall, because this is the space that we are in. I personally have never been at an institution which has had this kind of dedicated space to Black students, and it really feels incredible. I mean, you can tell, you know, there are always students coming in and out of here, for the faculty, for the staff, for everyone. It really means so much. So it's an honor to be a part of this community. And I'm going to thank my friend, Dr. India Lorik Wilmot, who I will also introduce when I'm finished with my comments. But India is a dear colleague, a neighbor, and a friend. And so it's such a pleasure to be in conversation with her, especially because she's a master at this. She has a podcast that I hope she'll tell you more about also. All right, so I'm happy to be here. I'm very excited. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Everyone feels so far away. I wish I could make you all move closer to me so I could feel your energy. But I will say that I'm, especially excited because this is not just my pleasure and distinct honor to be here to talk about the book that I wrote, but also to launch our series, which is called Reimagining Together. And the reason why we chose this theme of Reimagining Together is because I personally, it being my first year here, I'm really excited about the possibilities of what we can imagine together. As a literature scholar, I am the utmost believer in the imagination. I believe that through the imagination, we have the power to create, that the imagination can inspire us. It's an animating force that can teach us, it empowers us, and it activates us. When we deploy our imaginations, we begin to look at the world differently. Oftentimes when I'm working with students, I say, even when we're talking about problems on campus, right, campus organizing, and they say they're displeased with how the administration has responded, and I say, well, what do you imagine as a possibility, right? So when we think about activist work, creative work, literature, visual culture, the imagination is such an important part of everything that we do. And so I wanted to just tie all of those areas in together by using that theme of reimagining together. I know that for me personally, our field of Africana Studies would not exist if student activists had not imagined their universities as places where knowledge about Black people could be taught, affirmed, and created. For me, as a Haitian American woman, I come from a people who had to imagine a world without slavery in order to be free. So in my teaching, my writing, my activism against gender-based violence, I belong to communities where we're actively trying to imagine a world without sexual violence, for example. So I invite you to imagine with me. Today, as I'm speaking, I want you to imagine, what does the call to conscience look like for you? We each have one. What does it look like for you? I want you, those of us, my students in my classroom, and those of us who are in Africana Studies, I want us to imagine, what kind of program do we want? Here at Northeastern and CSSH, which kind of community do we want to create? How do we create a more just society, a more just campus, more just classes? These are all questions that I encourage you not only to ask yourselves, but to actively answer them, seek to answer them in a way that makes an impact in the world. So my book, The Trumpet of Conscience today, was born out of a desire to reimagine how we remember, memorialize, and learn from the teachings of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. So I've told this story, I think I've told the story many, many times, but for those who haven't heard it. The story behind this book is, it starts in 2019 when I was a professor at Boston College and I was invited to do one of those Martin Luther King keynote breakfasts, right? It's always a breakfast. So many breakfasts in the month of January, right? And so I was invited to be a keynote, and this was a very large event. Usually there are about 500 people there, and it's a university president's office level, right? So it's quite large, but it's sponsored by the Black Faculty Staff and Administrators Association. And so they invited me to give the keynote, and I knew that if I was going to talk about Martin Luther King, I had to do it in a way that was not, I always say, that took him out of the box, right? So I was so aware of this box that Martin Luther King had been put into, the I Have a Dream box, the colorblind society box, right? The peace box. And there's so few, he has so many teachings and so much writing that many people are not actually familiar with, that we like the little snapshot, right? We even just like to say MLK, right? We don't even say Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King all the time. And so I was really determined to think about King from a different angle. And that was when one of my dear friends, Sawika Colbert, I don't know if she's on here, but she advised me to look at the Trumpet of Conscience. And the Trumpet of Conscience are a series of lectures that King gave in 1967 for the Canadian Broadcast Company, the CBC. And there are two really important things about these lectures. First, he was not given a topic. So he could talk about anything he wanted. He has 5 speeches in that series. They include the conclusion, which is called A Christmas Sermon on Peace. He has another one on nonviolence in Vietnam. So it's really a range of topics. But it's so important because in that set of speeches, he writes, quote, "Not long after talking about the dream, I started seeing it turn into a nightmare," end quote. And I thought to myself, my goodness, if people knew about this speech, would they always use I Have a Dream as their one King speech that they quote or that they want to memorialize in January? And so in writing this book, I had 2 goals. Number 1, I wanted to encourage people to read beyond the dream. That is, to explore King's lesser-known work, especially the Trumpet of Conscience. And then, most importantly, in this book, I wanted to reflect on what do we learn when we take the insights from these lectures, they're also called the Massey Lectures, and apply that wisdom to contemporary social justice movements, specifically Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and prison abolition. And the reason why I wanted to do this was because these were movements that I had taught about, that I had thought about, that I felt passionate about, that I had organized around also. But I felt like oftentimes there was this dissonance where people weren't seeing this one long continuous Black freedom struggle, for example, or this one long continuous struggle for justice. And so I really wanted to use the Trumpet of Conscience as a lens for looking at these movements. Okay, so now I'm gonna read a passage from the book for you before India interviews me, and I forgot to put my timer on, so maybe, Savita, you can wave to me when it's time to stop. Okay, so I have to also confess that I was going to read a completely different part of the book. I was going to read the introduction, which I think gives a really great kind of overview of where I'm going. But then I felt compelled, also because my students in my gender and Black world literature class are here, I wanted to read something that was specifically about gender-based violence. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and so it's a topic that is very close to my heart. And you know, my book's epigraph is by Audre Lorde, and she says, "There is no such thing as single-issue struggles because we don't live single-issue lives." Ending sexual violence. If we do not stop to help the rape survivors, what will happen to them? On the second day of Christine Blasey Ford's testimony before the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee in 2018, I could not stop crying. I wept intermittently throughout the day for reasons related to Blasey Ford and beyond. Ford testified to address her allegations that Brett Kavanaugh had sexually assaulted her almost 40 years prior. As a Black feminist and scholar and activist, the hearings for me were painfully reminiscent of the Supreme Court nomination hearings in the 1990s when Anita Hill testified about her allegations of sexual harassment at the hands of Clarence Thomas. On the second day of Blasey Ford's testimony, I was traveling from Boston to Chicago for the 20th anniversary celebration of the performance Story of a Rape Survivor. After boarding the plane, I accidentally put my coffee on the wrong seat while placing my luggage in the overhead compartment. The coffee spilled. When I returned to what I thought was my seat, a white man was waiting for me and furiously started to shout at me for what I had done to his seat. I tried to explain that I thought the seat was mine and that it was an accident. He continued to shout. He called me stupid. I asked him not to raise his voice. Eventually, the flight attendant intervened, and I went to my correct seat, and the women around me looked at me sympathetically. But I could not stop crying. When the flight landed in Chicago, I saw reports of Dr. Blasey Ford on screen, and I began to cry again. Quote, "I am not here today because I want to be. I am terrified," end quote. Dr. Blasey Ford said. The terror was audible in her voice. It seemed to tremble with her every word. I was crying for her and for all of the survivors that I know. I was crying for those who shared their stories in public and for those who never would or never could. I know from the work that I have done with survivors in my research on rape culture that coming forward to share stories of sexual violence is already challenging enough without the pressure of a national and largely unsympathetic, I would add hostile now. You always find edits that you want to add after the book is written. It's so annoying. Unsympathetic and hostile audience, let alone being televised while doing so. I was crying over my sadness at the small and large injustices that occur every day and that women have to endure. And they train women and girls to believe that we do not matter as much as men. I was crying because I remember being in 8th grade when Anita Hill testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee. And I remember when Clarence Thomas was just appointed. I was crying because I know too many women who do not feel that their voices, their stories, their trauma, their lives matter. If we really believe that, in King's words, injustice anywhere is indeed a threat to justice everywhere, then the forms of injustice that are gender-specific should be of concern to anyone who cares about justice. Taking these words seriously means including sexism, misogyny, transphobia, and homophobia in our march to freedom. Although King is hardly known for waging a struggle against sexism and misogyny, any accurate application of his message requires attention to the ways in which sexism, patriarchy, misogyny, and gender inequality are also concerns of a faith that does justice. Many of his positions in the Trumpet of Conscience can be applied to the movement for gender equality in general, and more recently, the Me Too movement in particular. A better model, and his contemporary, who explicitly championed the rights of women as she participated in the Black freedom struggle, was Fannie Lou Hamer, a civil rights and voting rights activist who is not nearly as well known as King. When Hamer famously declared that nobody's free until everybody's free, it was not in reference to race. Everybody means every human being, regardless of gender, sexuality, age, or ability. Our freedom relies and depends on the liberation of others. Individual freedom matters little without attention to the collective. Lesbian warrior poet Audre Lorde, who we're reading this week, don't forget you're reading tomorrow, unpacks this point even more, explaining, quote, "I am not free as long as any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are very different from my own. And I am not free as long as one person of color remains chained, nor is any one of you," end quote. Our freedoms are linked. If we are to dream the revolutionary dreams that Nikki Giovanni alludes to in her poem earlier in the book, I talk about the poem, then we must advocate for people who are different from us. Although King often mentioned the poor, marginalized, and vulnerable, he rarely, if ever, mentioned women. Central to his philosophy was the idea that the struggle against injustice must include people beyond those it victimized. In other words, non-Black people need to work alongside Black people in the fight against racism. Wealthy people need to join the fight against social inequality and poverty. People of all genders must be engaged in the fight against sexist discrimination and gender-based violence. Despite King's failure to address gender injustice and inequality, his philosophy suggests that we should pay attention to every form of injustice, including the oppressions faced by women and gender nonconforming people. When we read the Trumpet of Conscience carefully, signs of this appear throughout. How much time do I have? That's good. Okay. I had like 3 more pages I was gonna read. But you can buy the book. And so, we can talk about that passage. Maybe, India, that will be the first question. But it felt right in my heart to read from that passage. Although it's a very strange thing, because I've written academic books. This is my first trade book, and it's so much more personal, right, and vulnerable. Although I felt very connected to my first book, and I feel very connected to the other academic book I wrote. But this one is much more personal in terms of I share about my life, as a parent. As the daughter of immigrants, as an activist, as an organizer in my town. I see, my friends from my town here too, who also works in Northeastern. Hi, Milton friends. And as a person of faith. And so I wanted to share that passage because I think that does give you a real taste of kind of how personal the book is, in addition to blowing out some of these larger questions about social justice, about Black freedom movements, about faith and social justice, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so I now have the pleasure of introducing my friend, Dr. India Lorick-Wilmot. She is a writer, sociologist, public scholar, and digital creator. As an educator at Northeastern, India is an affiliated faculty member of the Africana Studies program and a senior lecturer in sociology in the College of Professional Studies. She was the inaugural scholar in residence at our John D. O'Brien African American Institute. As a public scholar, writer, and social researcher, India's publications and research projects focus on issues impacting diverse racial and ethnic immigrant communities in the Americas. She's the author of 2 books, Creating Black Caribbean Ethnic Identity, 2010, and Stories of Identity Among Black Middle-Class Second-Generation Caribbeans, We Too Sing America, 2017. As a digital creator, India's digital media project, Journeys of Belonging to Blackness, this is the podcast I was talking about, which includes a YouTube channel and a podcast, endeavors to amplify and center the positive experiences of African descendants in public discourse. The podcast, Talking Journeys of Belonging to Blackness, has listeners in 30 countries worldwide and is available wherever podcasts are accessed. Thank you, India, for being in conversation with me today. Thank you.
I want to give you a hug. Thank you. Well, good afternoon. Thank you for that lovely, lovely introduction. I appreciate it. And I loved your remarks.
Thank you.
Yes. So I think in many ways, to kick off our conversation, I think it's necessary for me to give a prelude. And so some of my thoughts and musings around reading this deliciously wonderful book. So there's an urgency we see today in both global media and academic works to discuss themes such as Black liberation, sovereignty, racism, poverty, war, gender equity, migration, and the mobilization of young people, right? So whether we're talking about the global public health pandemic of COVID-19 and its disproportionate impact on communities of color, the working class, women, and the undocumented, whether we're also exploring these themes when we're talking about the global pandemic of systemic racism, with the murders of so many African-descended people, including right here in the United States, with Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and Ahmaud Arbery, which right now there's a murder trial happening. Hopefully people are tuning in. And then not just here in the US, but in Brazil and France and other places. We're also talking about these themes in terms of the mass migration of Haitian and Central and South American men, women, and children arriving at our U.S. southern borders, seeking asylum, fleeing extreme gang violence, kidnapping, abductions, rapes, murders, and political unrest. Unfortunately, these magnificent divisions that persist not only in terms of public opinion and in discourse, but in terms of economic, racial, social inequalities and the treatment of Black and brown and trans bodies by government-sanctioned and a militarized police state has remained a mainstay in public consciousness. So for the purpose of our conversation today, these divisions go as far back to the winter of 1967, when Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. provided his own testimony in a 5-part lecture series for the CBC, referred to as the Trumpet of Conscience. And now we have your timely book, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Trumpet of Conscience Today, wherein you look to 3 contemporary social justice movements, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and the prison abolition movement, and goad readers to not only reflect, but also employ the tenets of Martin Luther King's lectures. So for me, your book does a type of constant reappraisal of what it means to be human, when there's constant flux and challenges that impact specific populations within the confines of structural inequalities. You goad us to interrogate our own conscience to determine what is right and what is just for all. So in effect, for me, and I hope that this goes the same for readers in the audience, that your book provides a space of reckoning wherein we can reflect and return to the history of the past so we can examine how to proceed and envision the present and the future. It is my hope that our conversation this afternoon serves as a reparations of imagination, right? The new ways and epistemologies of how we can endeavor, uplift humanity, and triumph as a peoples. So for those, and I know you listen to my podcast, you know I like to peel back the onion a bit.
Yes.
And so one of your parting remarks when you left the podium, you were reflecting on what this book means to you. And so I'm going to ask you, on the personal side, as a Black feminist scholar, a cultural critic, a child of Haitian immigrants, and a self-identified follower of Jesus. Personally, why this book and why now?
Thank you, India. You know, it feels very personal for me on the one hand, because I think about it in terms of my career also. You know, I started out at Boston College, which is a Jesuit institution. And a lot of the talks that I gave, actually, so I was looking at some of the chapters, and sometimes I would, I drew from talks that I gave. And so it's things that had kind of been building, I think, for a very long time in me, right? So even if I think about my time at Boston College, the work with A Long Walk Home, the work with Shatter the Silence, even the church that I go to, actually this year was the year of justice in our church, right? So even as I think about, I can't think about this book coming out without thinking about it in a very personal way, just in terms of where I am in my career. Also, we know that in academia, they say you write your first book to get tenure, and the second book you write because you love it. I don't agree with that, because my first book, I loved it. I really loved writing it. But it is true that I wrote that book to get tenure. I couldn't have written this book and gotten tenure, right? Because it's a trade book, right? It's not an academic book. So it is, on the one hand, for me, very personal. But then there's also, we're in this moment, right, as a culture, and I see it with my students, I see it with, the young people that I encounter and that I work with. We're in this moment as a culture where justice is really kind of having the layers of it pulled back, right? People are finally understanding that, when you say Black Lives Matter, too often it felt like women weren't included in that, right? Even though women started the movement. but that it's not just enough to say Black Lives Matter. You have to behave as though all Black lives matter. It doesn't matter if they're Black trans lives, if they're Black queer lives, if they're Black poor lives, like if they're Black Haitian lives, right? Last week I was at a conference with Ayanna Pressley, and she kept saying, Haitian lives are Black lives. So all the people that are standing up and saying Black Lives Matter, when Haitians are mistreated at the border, they need to stand up and say that, right? Black Lives Matter around the globe. So I think what's happening with these movements, and we can say that, for each one of them, there's this peeling back that's happening that's causing us, I hope, that's causing us to think more in an interconnected way. And I was so struck because that was one of King's central messages in the Trumpet of Conscience. Everything is interrelated. Everything is connected. I'm like, this is what Black feminists are saying. King was a Black feminist. I discovered it. No, I'm just kidding. And then the other thing is, you brought up that word reckoning, and it's a word that, to be honest with you, I hated when, Harvey Weinstein and the second wave of Me Too. And we all know Me Too was founded by Tarana Burke, but then it was kind of reignited, right, in 2016, 2017. And I hated this idea of because I felt like people were saying a reckoning with social justice or a reckoning with racism, and it meant that everything was going to be fixed. But, for me, as someone interested in language, I'm like, reckoning, ing, is the gerundive, right? It means that it's ongoing. It's not like a reckoned. It's not like it's been reckoned. It's a reckoning, which means that work is ongoing. It's not a quick fix. So that's the other thing that I'm thinking about, is that some of this working out, the peeling back of the layers, is in fact that reckoning. It is the gerundive ongoing work of this movement towards freedom and liberation for all people.
No, I really appreciate that, which is why I framed it as a reckoning in that way, and that the book in and of itself creates that space so that we can be engaged in that dialogue with ourselves and then with others in the community when we're passing around the book to say, did you read this? What did you think? Let's be reflective, right? And that's part of that reparations of imagination that you're calling us to do. I'm going to jump around a little bit, and I think I want to focus on the lectures specifically for Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And in the book, you also cite to it, but he oftentimes refers to that there are like these triple American evils: racism, materialism, and militarism, right? And in many ways, it's really talking about the function and the material of power, right? And so, given that, I often reflect on the activity of decolonial love. And how, depending on the situation, it requires taking up of arms in protection of people and for justice from the horrible legacy of colonial violence, right? And I also think about the quote by my favorite author, Audre Lorde, when she says, quote, "Sometimes we are blessed with being able to choose the time and the arena and the manner of our revolution, but more usually we must do battle where we are standing." And so decolonial love implies restructuring the world. So is it possible for justice and decolonization efforts to be without violence?
Oh, I think about this a lot in relation to, some of the teaching that I've done over the years, right? So that I taught first of all, I have to say, as an anti-violence activist, I'm not going to say that we need violence. I will never say that, right? That's something that I will never say. I do think specifically with regards to that idea of battle, I do think that, it is a fight, right? Like it is a fight. That there are literally people that are fighting for their lives, right? That it's not this kind of, that the fight doesn't feel always just metaphorical. I think about something like transphobia and the number of Black trans youth we have that are suicidal, right? Like the numbers are staggering, right? So when we say that we have to be a community that loves everyone, that is inclusive, that tells children, all Black children, that they matter, regardless of how they identify, what their pronouns are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that feels very real to me, right? So I think the stakes are very real. I think that, as you consider so I was going to refer to some of the teaching that I've done over the years, especially in the French departments, right? Teaching about Senegal, teaching about a lot of these places in French-speaking West Africa specifically. And how, Frantz Fanon, for example, from Martinique, right? He wrote about he wrote about the colonial struggle, and he wrote that there can be no decolonization without violence. That I agreed with at the time, right? Because again, we're thinking about it specifically within that time of the 1960s. I think when we talk about decolonial love, though, that to me, there's like, in order for, right now, when we're talking about something that's decolonial, I think we have to wrest ourselves from that violence, right? And I think that we have seen too many examples of how violence, people in our communities have been targeted by violence, that I'm just not someone that's comfortable. Actually, if you read my first book, you would know that I don't like metaphors about violence at all. It's something that drives me crazy. And part of the reason why I wrote that book, that first book, was because I got tired of people using rape metaphors. You know, I remember I got into an elevator one time when I was at Boston College, and a student said, "Oh, that test raped me." And I was like, wow. And so I take very seriously the use of that language of violence, the lexicon of violence, and the work that it's doing, because whenever we say that, there are, when people say, oh, the rape of the African continent, we can talk about slavery or colonization as the rape of the African continent. That doesn't account for people that have actually experienced that, right? And so I really try to give a kind of survivor-centered, I would say love and justice-centered view of sexual violence and all forms of violence, I would say. So I don't think I really answered your question about, well, you know my stance on violence now, and you know my stance about violence metaphors. But I think that it's not, we just have to remember that it's not, as a Black feminist, I'm always trying to collapse this binary between theory and praxis. And I even tell my students, like, these things that we're talking about in the classroom, they have a meaning for people's actual lives, right? And we can't forget that. And I think that's what I appreciated also about writing this book. Is, my partner always jokes that, like, he's like, oh, finally you wrote a book that I can give to people. Because, it is written, like, it's written in very plain language. There's not, I do not use epistemology. I use it many times in my first book, and I use it many times in my third book, but I even think about, like, what kind of words are we using that might even alienate people, And so my desire was really to bring people in. The last thing I'll say about this is I really love this quotation by Cornel West, where he says, justice is what love looks like in public, right? And so what love looks like in public would never include violence. So that's what I say about that.
No, I love that. And, at least for me, when I thought about, all right, so what question am I going to ask? And, again, of course, in the academy, there are so many buzzwords. It went from post-colonial to now decolonial. And
right, how many people even know what decolonial means?
And it's like so sexy. But, one of the things about the concept of love, when I, too, was reflecting on this question, so I appreciate for you, the utility around the lexicon of violence and what that means metaphorically. And then I thought, well, love is actually something that's quite powerful. And perhaps you'll disagree with my framing, but I think love is violent in the sense that if the intention is to, particularly when it comes to decolonialization, where it's a revelation around the ways in which we have these where we're informed by these structures of oppression, then love fractures that. And love is so powerful that the violence of it is so disruptive.
Yeah, I would never agree with that, because I can't think about
Baldwin
love
does
and
that.
violence without thinking about, even like teenagers, right, that I've worked with who are dating, right, who are in teen dating violence relationships. And so I can't, like, that's what immediately comes to mind, right? So I'm like, no, because there's a teenage girl that is dating a guy that just slapped her or punched her and thinks that is love and thinks that that's, so.
Yeah, and it's a challenge because James Baldwin also contends with this, particularly in his book, Go Tell It on the Mountain, right? Where when he's talking about discrimination and what it is to be embodied physically and metaphorically as a Black person, he uses faith in the same way as Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King talks about faith as to why he chooses nonviolence, but the structure of love itself is violent in the system of white supremacy, not so much as interpersonal, but I understand. And so for me, I kind of reflect in that sort of interesting dichotomy of looking at the power of love, which is why people were very reticent and rejected his approach to the concept of love as part of being faith-based, as a part to his methodology around civil rights as well.
Yeah.
But we can continue to talk about this offline. I want to ask one last question, and I get this because you start off with the book talking about the Good Samaritan ethos, and you also end the book that way. So in the beginning, you cite to Carl Wendell Jr.'s poem, A Dead Man's Dream, and
good.
quoted, "It is easier to build monuments than to build a better world." Right? And so for me, we would need to have a genealogy of freedom, okay, in order to understand the entanglements of modern capitalism and our efforts for freedom so we can build a better world, right? And so that would require serious effort. So if we were to employ the Good Samaritan ethos, how do we engage in the intellectual, social, political, and economic practices of freedom that can positively amplify humanity globally?
So the reason why I use the example of the Samaritan, and I love my friend, Quentin Powell, who's a dear friend, who gave, I can't remember if he was giving a talk, and he gave this talk where he pointed out that if you read the passage, it doesn't say the Good Samaritan, right? That we as a culture have decided that we should call this person the Good Samaritan. And so what I love about the Samaritan and the way that King uses that in the Trumpet of Conscience is that that's actually not from that's actually from, I think, Letter from a Birmingham Jail, actually, that he uses this, that example of the Samaritan. But I use it in the book because it inspires me. And it inspires really the frame of the book, right? So when I said, if we do not care about the rape survivors, what will become of them, right? So the story that King tells is that what happens to the Samaritan, so the reason why we know this difference, and for people that don't know the story, it's a story about, 3 people, so there's a man lying on the road, he's been robbed and beaten, and 3 different people walk by, and the only person that stops is the Samaritan to help him and puts him on his way and gives him food and clothing and makes sure he has shelter and gives him the coat off of his back. And King says, what distinguishes the Samaritan from these other people is that the other people said, oh my gosh, if I stop to help this man, what's going to happen to me? Whereas the Samaritan says, if I do not stop to help this person, what will happen to them, right? So you see the difference. So again, let's say, my friend is experiencing something, right? Or I'm talking this teen with dating violence that I'm dealing with, and they call me and they're like, Professor Jean-Charles, can I talk to you right now? And I could say, oh, okay, what's going to happen to me if I stop and take this call when I have to go pick up my kids from school, and then I have to go teach, and then I have to make sure I put in that article, or I have to do this other thing, right? What's going to happen to me, or what's going to happen to this person, right? And this is what Tarana Burke actually means when she talks about empowerment through empathy, right? That we have to do our activist work from a place of empathy. So for me, a Samaritan ethos is actually one in which you would be putting that other person at the center. So it's exactly what I say about, a survivor-centered ethic, or what will become of the Haitian refugees if we do not stop for them, right? If we do not speak out, And I think that is always displacing yourself. That kind of ethic is about displacing yourself from the story and thinking about who the most marginalized, the person who is most at risk, the person who potentially will be the most harmed in whatever the scenario is. And I don't think that this is something that only applies to, I think that this is something that you can employ in your daily life, right? I think that this can happen in the classroom, that this can happen in your households. And that if we constantly ask ourselves that question, so this person that is the most marginalized, that is the most oppressed, that is the most vulnerable, that is the most potentially harmed in this situation, what will become of them if and this is not to say so in like a missionary way, right? It's not like I'm the savior, I'm gonna come help this person, I'm gonna fix their lives. No, that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about like, let's all go doing community service because we're gonna save the children in Roxbury. No, that's not what we're talking about at all. But what we are talking about is, an understanding that we each have a call to conscience, right? To bring it back to the book. And that there is some ways that if you're willing to displace yourself, there is something your conscience will tell you, something that your conscience will prompt you to do.
I do have one last question. And I think it'll be helpful in terms of, a nice segue. Right? And it's around the fact that, yes, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King wrote in his letter from a Birmingham jail, as you paraphrased, we must be proximate to injustice in order to combat it. And one of the things in his Impasse of Race lecture is, and I thought it was really interesting when we were to, if we were to employ it and apply it today with Black Lives Matter, because he makes a remark that says that when Blacks saw injustice, right, they saw a need for freedom and liberation. Whites saw violence. And I think that's in many ways when we're all in this pandemic, people's reactions to seeing the murder of George Floyd.
Yep.
Some saw this as a cry in need for liberation. Folks were shocked with the violence. So what does this proximity look like when folks make the distinction when they assert being an ally versus an accomplice?
So, okay, I just want to say something quickly. So I think that, so what you're saying is that people branded it as violence, right? So that some, we know that like the cry of the rioter is the cry of the unheard, right? So we know that like those uprisings or rebellions, as Tiffany Hinton calls them, were not violence, right? That it wasn't the violence. And often, as we know, as with January 6th, it also depends on what the color is of the person, right? Who is being the insurrectionist. So I just wanted to just be very clear about this distinction. So you're saying that some people see it as violence, whereas others see it as...
So in the lecture, King actually says that with all of the unrest that was happening and the rebellions and so forth, that the perception was that Blacks or African descendants themselves saw that this is an opportunity to cry out for liberation. Right?
Yep, exactly.
And according to him, whites of that time saw all the things that they were seeing play out in the media as violence, hence the motivation as to what called them to action, right? And so he proceeds to go on in the lecture to talk about, our white brothers and sisters banding together. And it took me to just even when we talked about George Floyd.
So you see a parallel,
I see a parallel, right? In the sense of, well, how is it being framed in public discourse,
Absolutely,
right?
yes.
And then I see a distinction between the ways in which people self-identify and insert themselves to say, I'm an ally, but then others are saying, no, I'm actually an accomplice, right?
I don't think that many people are saying that. I think that that's another thing that we is slowly kind of happening, right? So I think that the language has been a language of allyship. I don't like that language because I think it creates a distance. I believe that either you care about a cause or you don't, right? So again, if it's a human rights issue, I don't need to call myself something special just to be, stand up and hold my sign or be an anti-rape advocate or what have you. And so I don't like the use of the term allies because I just feel like either you care about it or you don't. The call for accomplices or co-conspirators, which is a trend that we're seeing a lot in this past, you think about, Ijoma Oluwo, or all these books, How to Be Less Stupid About Race, all these books that are coming out, the writing the anti-racist wave. Those books aren't my favorite, I have to admit. But the wave that we see now is people are pushing back against the use of the term ally and encouraging people, instead of just, ally feels passive, right? Whereas an accomplice is, I'm actually going to give up some of my power, or I'm going to do something in order to move this struggle forward, right? Another way that people talk about this is saying, spending your privilege, right? Because a lot of times with students, they'll say, you have these students that tell you, I'm aware of my privilege and I know my privilege is this, that, and the other, but are you willing? And that's great, awareness is great, but there's another step, and another step after that, and another step after that, right? So to me, that's what, I guess, your question, you're framing about ally or accomplice, that's how I think about that.
Well, your book definitely charges us to consider our conscience, right? So I know we have to table this part, but thank you. This was really interesting and compelling.
We have lots more to talk about.
We do.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Q&A portion of this event. I'd like to invite all folks who are here in the room in person who have questions to line up right behind me here on the right-hand side. But we are going to start with virtual questions. Okay. We're going to ask folks to submit virtual questions if they're listening online via the live chat. And we're going to start with one of those questions or one of the pre-submitted questions that you sent in through the form. So I'll invite Savita, who's kindly going to speak on their behalf first.
So the first question is, how did you manage the emotional labor of writing a book that is so personal and existentially crucial to you?
Oh, can you tell me who that question is from? Do you know?
Mika.
That was not expected. I thought it was going to be one of my friends who was like tuning in from New York, and I was going to say, just call me, we can talk about this later. So I think, I did write this book. I wrote this book in a pandemic, right? Because I gave the speech in 2019, and then I didn't tell the full story, but I turned it into an op-ed because I believe that no writing should ever be wasted. I always tell my students, especially my grad students, that if you give a talk, turn it into something. Could be an op-ed, could be for public media, it doesn't matter, but do something else with it. Don't just let it lie. So I turned it into an op-ed, and then the editor approached me and asked me if I would be interested in turning the op-ed into a book. And at first I thought, no, I actually wouldn't. But then, after much reflection and prayer and a lot of urging from my beloved, I realized that I could do this in the way that I wanted to, which was to talk about Me Too, the things that mattered to me, right, from a Black feminist perspective. And so it was 2019, then the op-ed. Okay, so I think we got the contract right after, like late 2019, and then 2020 happened, right? So most of this writing was done during the pandemic. And so that was already a weight that was on me, right? Because I'm a very empathetic person. And when I tell you, every death, I was reading, my sister Kia is here and she knows, like I was reading all the exposés in the beginning and I would just cry and cry and cry. And it was so hard, right? Because I felt that my empathetic heart was thinking about like people who are undocumented and people for whom home is not a safe place and they have to shelter in place with their abuser. Or students that I have who were food insecure and now had to leave campus or, had to live in the same house as their stepfather that's sexually abusing them. So it was a lot for me, the pandemic. And also I'm an extrovert, so that was just not a good combination. And I feel like writing was very much my refuge. I would go, you can ask my kids, I would go lock the office door and mommy would be writing and nobody could bother me. And so I do feel that writing helped me. I'm an avid journaler. I do believe that writing, is a gift that I have and a calling. And so being able to kind of channel that really did help me. And I think that with the personal parts, it really came in gradually, right? The first thing I did was I read the Trumpet of Conscience, the Massey lectures. I read it like 3 times. And then I just wrote out all the quotations that I found compelling. And at first, the book changed. I was going to write about the refugee crisis. And then I decided no, actually, this is how I came up with this framework of ending racism, ending sexual violence, ending mass incarceration. And so really kind of locating it in this idea of the imagination, right? And how do we end these things? And so even, I said this when I wrote my first book about rape culture, even when I'm writing about things that are very challenging, I generally try to do so in a hopeful way so that I'm not just hitting you with all of the Black suffering, but you also see some kind of streams of Black joy coming out. Thank you.
Thank you.
And since we have no in-person questions yet, Savita, can you ask a virtual question for us?
Yes. How do you choose readers to rely on when revisiting your work?
Oh, Savita, I cannot hear you at all.
I'll take off the mask.
This is like class all over again.
How do you choose readers to rely on when revisiting your work?
How do I choose readers to rely on when
revisiting your work? Revising.
Oh, revising. Oh, interesting. Well, Nicole Aljo, who was here, was the director of Africana Studies before me. She was in one of the very first writing groups I was ever in. I really believe in having writing groups, writing partners, writing accountability partners. That group that Nicole and I were in, there were 12 of us, and we were all Black women, faculty in Boston in the New England area, and we met for about 6 years for every month. And, they could be brutal. I remember I have a friend who I gave her something to read and she'll curse at me sometimes in the margins. Like, what are you doing? My spouse is that kind of person too. He'll write this is too much prose. You're not writing a novel, And so I have been blessed to have a lot of readers, right? Largely because I'm a professional writer and I'm in a literary field, and I have a lot of friends who are in those fields. So I have my tried and true kind of writing partners that I go to. There's some that are more gentle than others. But somehow the gentle ones are never available. It's always the harsh ones that are available to give feedback most quickly. My friend that is the harshest also is the quickest with giving feedback. So I can rely on that person because I know they'll get it back to me quickly. And I trust them because they're not just telling me, oh, you did a great job. Hello.
Hi, oh my God. Hi, Dr. Jean-Charles. I really wanted to ask about how you would respond to people who might say that given that this is Martin Luther King and his the primary audience were Black people in the United States, what would you say to people who are like, this is bounded by the United States, like this is bounded in the experiences of Black people in the United States?
Thank you for that question, Titi. You know, this is something I think about a lot. So I would say two things. First of all, read the Trumpet of Conscience, because he goes on and on about the importance of the global, right? And he says we are in a global struggle, and that we cannot look at the struggle from, he even says, you know, the struggle of his brother that's on the streets of Chicago is not different from his brother in the streets of Vietnam, right? Or it's something to that effect. But basically the idea that we are in a global struggle, right? And so when we talk about this fight against militarism, materialism, and racism, right? And capitalism, this is a global struggle. And so I would really kind of insist on those passages. I would probably just pick them out and say, well, no, here's what he says, and here's what he says in terms of the global vision. But then the other thing is, you know, I don't believe in a bounded Blackness period, right? And maybe it's because I am the child of Haitian immigrants. But I just believe that the more capacious we are in our thinking and in our theorizing and in our ability to make connections across the diaspora, which is why Africana Studies is a great field to be in. Hi, Sarah. You know, the more rich our thinking gets, right? Because we can look at the differences and the similarities, right? We can say, we're not just saying, oh yes, all Black people are the same all over the world, but we're able to appreciate what some of the distinctions are. We're able to appreciate the nuances, and that really sharpens our analysis. Thank you for that.
So the next pre-submitted question is, what advice do you have for folks who want to publish one day?
Lots of writing questions. I really love talking about writing, actually. It's one of my favorite activities. Some of my friends in my group are here and they know. Hi, Sarah. This is my daughter here. So what advice do I have for someone that wants to publish? Read. Read. Don't listen to books. Read them. You can listen to books because you'll still get the content, as my educator friends tell me. But if you really want to learn about craft, it helps to kind of see and interact with the words on the page. And you know, you learn more about your style. So one of the books that I really enjoyed reading that helped me as I was writing this book was Austin Channing Brown's book. What is it? I'm Still Here. I don't know. I'm like, did you interview on your podcast? And I love that book because, again, it's a trade book. It's a New York Times bestseller. She writes very honestly about racial injustice, about racism, about sexism, and from the perspective of a person of faith. So that was a book that I really enjoyed, and that was so accessible. It was a New York Times bestseller. So when I knew that I was going to write a trade book, I had to switch up my reading more too, right? Like I couldn't just. It wasn't like the process of doing research for my academic books. And there's so many, I'm also grateful because I do think from the time I published my first book in 2014 to today, academic writing has changed a lot, right? There's much more room to be creative, right? I'm thinking of like Christina Sharp and Kevin Quashie, and there's so many ways in which that even those forms, and it's no longer just the senior scholars that are doing it. You can even have someone write their first book. I'm thinking about my friend Ashawn Crawley, for example, who his first book was also very poetic in ways that I think were unexpected. So I don't mean to put academic writing in this box because I don't think it belongs there. But yes, so my advice is to read. My advice is to write every day. I believe in writing every day. I know some people hate that. They think it's very, it's too like autocratic. But I believe in writing every day, even if it's only for 20 minutes. Have people read your work. And submit. Don't be afraid. My first book, I think for my first book, I sent my book proposal to 20 presses before I got a book contract. I know now I'm a full professor, I can say that and not feel bad, but 5 years ago I would have never admitted that. Yeah, and then for my second academic book, the process was much quicker, right? And then this one I was asked to write, but don't be afraid of rejection, I'd say is another good piece of advice.
Thank you. And we do have time for 2 more questions. Since there's no in-person yet, we'll take 2 virtual ones.
I thought Farrah had a question. Farrah, do you have a question? You sure? I see you waving around. Okay.
She's like, don't put me on the spot.
No student questions? Isn't there extra credit for that?
There's a virtual question from Richard Adje. My apologies if I mispronounced your name. Indeed, the Black Lives Matter movement applies to all Black people, including the trans community, Haitians, and even Africans. How do you think this movement, which is more popular in developed countries in North America and Europe, for example, applies to countries in Africa, South America, the Caribbean, and even Asia?
Say it again. What's the last part? He said, how do I think?
This movement applies to countries in Africa, South America, the Caribbean, and South Asia.
Oh.
Because it's more popular in developed countries like North America and Europe.
Oh, I see. Richard, I thought we weren't using that developed countries language anymore, my brother. Richard actually is my brother, so he knows that. The global south, perhaps. But so I think it's there, Richard. Look at NSARS in Nigeria. You know, I do think, because again, if you're thinking about what Black Lives Matter stands for, and this is why I love Tarana Burke, and I encourage everyone to get her memoir Unbound also. But one of the things that Tarana Burke in that memoir is doing is also reminding us that so often when we say Black Lives Matter, when harm happens, when violence happens to Black women, I'm smiling because I see one of my mentees, Bibi. She's in law school now, back there. So unfortunately, what has happened a lot is that Black Lives Matter, despite the fact that it was started by Black women, is often co-opted, right, in a way that makes us think that when we remember, you know, Kimberly Crenshaw has this wonderful TED Talk where she asks people to name, sit down if you've heard the name of this person. So she'll say, you know, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd. It was before Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, but I'm giving you an example. Trayvon. So she names Black men that have been killed by police, and everybody knows who they are. And then she names women, and very few people know who any of the women are, right? And this is an activity I do with my students. And so my point is that it is false that Black Lives Matter is only about one thing, right? And I actually talk about this in the book too, and I talk about how the originators of the movement, because sometimes what the founders intend for is not always what we see. Oh my God, I'm seeing all my former students. It's too much. What the founders of the movement intend, okay, I'll give you a better example. So with Black feminism, the founders, the women that wrote the Combahee River Collective, a Black feminist statement, the women that wrote a Black feminist statement, they said from the beginning, we are third world women, we are global, right? My students read this article. We have a global vision. But then later on, there came to be this idea that Black feminism was African American feminism, and that's it, right? The Black Lives Matter Network, the movement for Black Lives, they have always been explicit that this is global. I have gone to Paris. This student was right here with me in Paris, where we interacted with organizers. Assa Traoré, who is one of the activists, prominent activists. Her brother was killed by the police in France. And so yes, that's in France. But I think to Richard's question is that unfortunately anti-Blackness is a global struggle, absolutely, right? And so we can see that in Brazil there is a need to say Black Lives Matter. In Nigeria there's a need to say Black Lives Matter. There's a need to say all Black Lives Matter. There's a need to say Black trans lives matter in Ghana. There's a need to say, you know, when you see that the violence that's being meted out against, you know, girls, right, or trans people, LGBTQ people, Black Lives Matter encompasses all of that. So I think that a truly intersectional understanding of Black Lives Matter will also allow us to see how and why it applies in the global context, especially in the global South. That's my long answer to Richard.
Hi. So, I don't know if you can hear me. So within the introduction, when you kind of talk about it just being a sick society from
already
MLK's,
read the book?
Well, no, but I just I read the introduction.
Okay.
Still so much more great content to read. But you talk about, it's a sick society, being from MLK's perspective and quote on it being a sick society. And, throughout history and really the past couple of decades, there's been so much decade on Dr. King's visions and ideologies as, being associated with, as you were talking about, just like the lexicon and the way that we explain things, something that's radical. And you've seen the same for Black feminism, especially for, the younger girls and thinking of new resistance in this age. So my question to you is, what is your advice for the new generation of, young Black feminists that are also looking forward to, take from the past and take from history, but also revolutionize new identities and new perspectives as you are doing with this book?
So Grace, I know you all. I know that you are part of that young generation Black feminist. I actually feel like you all are doing it. I was so touched by the foreword that Sean Copeland, who's my colleague at Boston College, former colleague at Boston College, she wrote. And she wrote something that I had never thought about. But she says something that, okay. So Jean-Charles illumines the pedagogical power of King's life, message, and vision to teach all of us about our various necessary and differentiated roles and tasks in repudiating the nation's interconnected evils of racism, poverty, war, and violence. By drawing our attention to the radical intersectional character of these lectures, she helps us, especially the young among us, to discover a voice that continues to speak justice for all. And there's a chapter in the Trumpet of Conscience, the original, that's called Youth and Social Action. And I talk about that a lot in this book, because I talk about this kind of younger generation of activists, including you and your friends, and how much we have to learn from you also, right? I think that that's one of the greatest gifts of your generation, is that you're learning from the past, you're rooted in the present, and you're imagining kind of new futures, right? And I see it. I see it in the digital work. I see it in the way that you all, I think I can say that I know when I was an undergrad, I think when I look at my undergrads now, they're doing things that I never imagined doing in undergrad. And so I think that my advice really is to keep doing what you're doing, but also to surround yourself with like-minded people, not just from your school, but from other schools, both in the country, in the city, in the country, and around the world, right? Because I do believe that those movements can be multiplied and grow, and you're already doing that also. Mm-hmm. Grace was my student at Boston College. She was in the first Black Lives Matter Me Too class. She also went to Paris with me, and then she later on was a teaching assistant for the Black Lives Matter class, and she's a senior now. Bye.
Thank you so much, everyone, for those wonderful questions. Before we wrap up the event and transition to the book signing portion, I received an email from Regine's husband, who asked me to make some time for the book to be blessed. So I would like to invite for the priest to come up to the stage, perhaps to the podium, wherever he's sitting. Is he here today? Okay. Is your husband here? I can't see.
He is here. I actually would like to ask, I have two friends who could serve in this capacity for me. Pastor Kia, Sister Tara, one very passionate about prison abolition. Another sister, they've been walking with me as I wrote this book and as I researched, and I would love to have you all do a blessing for this book. I don't know, I've never been to a book blessing, so I don't know.
Here we go. Well, we say good afternoon, and sister, we are so proud to be here with you today, and it has been a gift to all of us to hear your words of love and how you have inspired us to continue to be a voice for justice. So in our faith, we say to our God that you would bless this book right now, and that the words of this book will not just be read by the students at Northeastern or students who are using this book in their courses, but that this book will be read in many, 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 many different communities, God. I pray and I ask right now that this book will continue to be a voice, Lord, for love, a voice for justice. Lord God, a voice that would cause us all to come together, and that when we see violence, as was spoken about today, when we see those who are in need, that we would respond and that we would act, Lord. Let this not just be something that we receive for ourselves, but that it would go out and justice will roll, God. Justice will flow. Justice will bring about the transformation and change that you desire.
Amen. First, I just want to say if I knew I was going to do this, I would have brushed my hair. But we're just showing up. Here we are. Abba, we bless your name and call you holy, and we thank you that we get to serve and follow the God of justice. Throughout all of Scripture, you call us to do justice and to walk humbly with you. And so we bless this book as a book of justice, as an emissary of justice, as words of justice, and in all the ways that Régine talked about, the power of words and the lexicon we choose. We just pray that this would go out, and in the ways that words create things, that it would create spaces of justice, conversations of justice, actions of justice, and that in the way that your call is on all people of all faiths, we pray that this book would go out and bring those people of all faiths together to magnify you and to make this into the world you called it to be, where all people flourish. Thank you for Régine. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Have fun.
And we'd like to conclude this event by inviting Savita up to the stage to close for us.
Thank you all for coming. We appreciate you joining us to celebrate Dr. Jean-Charles and the launch of Martin Luther King and the Trumpet of Conscience today. We also wanted to give a special thanks to Dr. Richard O'Brien and the Institute, Dr. India Lorick-Wilmot, and Dean Poiger. We have a lot more events coming, and we hope to see all of you there, especially on November 9th with our conversation with Mayor Kim Janey that looks at civic and community engagement. Please keep your eyes peeled for updates, and you can find updates on our social media, NU_CSDS. We're on every platform. And Africana Studies classes for spring 2020 are now online, so please make sure you sign up for all, or at least one. Flyers are at the front. I now invite you to the back of the room for the book signing. Again, thank you for coming, and please join me in a round of applause for Dr. Jean-Charles.